The role queue beta has dropped, and of course, you guys want to know how to climb the ranks faster than anyone else. Thankfully, I've come up with a crash course of 10 important things you need to know about role queue. My name is Nate, and welcome to Blizzard Guides. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the placement, a bit about the MMR reset, and then just how to climb and role queue just regularly and competitively. So you'll have a little bit of everything. I'll have some special tips for DPS, support, and tank, and some general tips and everything that you really should know about role queue so that you can climb really quickly. Coming in at number 10, you should know about the soft MMR reset. Now, the details about this are shaky. You have a lot of people saying that there is no MMR reset whatsoever and that your MMR stays the same. Some people are saying that MMR is being reset, and there's a lot of confusion. As far as I can deduce, there is a soft MMR reset. What I mean is that depending on how much variance there is on your individual skill on a certain role, you'll observe what is pretty much an MMR reset, but not a complete MMR reset. So the game still knows that if you're plat, you're probably going to be somewhere around plat on a specific role, but you could be a lot better or a lot worse. For example, I had a friend who's generally in the platinum range, but his support placement on PTR ended up being masters and his DPS gold. My diamond smurf placed all high masters on all roles, and after a few more games I ended up actually where my real SR is. So I think that what's happening here is that the MMR system is more likely to boost you closer to where your skill level is determined by the game. So that means that there's a huge opportunity to gain a ton of SR on the roles that you're really good at, and conversely, there's also the chance that you lose a lot of SR on the roles that you're not that good at. But since you'll be in a role queue, being a lower rank is actually not as punishing as it was before, since you can count on your teammates actually being the rank they should be, and not get those DPS players that decide to learn main tank all of a sudden, or vice versa. So what does that say about placements? What's the best way to go about placements so that you can flex on your friends with a shiny new rank? Well, truth be told, unlike before when I would say something about playing for stats so that you can place high off the bat, or making sure that you don't feed your mind out at least, in this case with role queue, I actually recommend that you play like you normally would and play for a win. Here's why. While it is true that with role queue, like with old comp, you'll place higher if you have better stats, it seems that the role queue matchmaker is more likely to let you drop hundreds of SR at a time, or let you climb hundreds of SR at a time. I tested this out on 2 diamond level SR smurfs. They were both 3300 when I started. One I played normally like I would, and then one I just specialized for stats, and I'd farm damage, I'd farm shield break, healing, etc. Whatever I could, I would farm it. The one for stats plays something like 3800 on all rolls, and the normally played ones, I actually play something like 3500 or 3600, but I noticed that I gained more SR and lost less SR on the lower SR smurf, which made it a lot easier to climb since I was gaining a ton and losing very, very little. This actually stayed true for my actual SR counts up in the 4100 to 4300 SR range, so it seems like the matchmaker does place a higher value on actually trying to win during placements and getting close matches, or at least matches that have a bit more winning on your own end. But with that said, there's also a bit of specialization needed for each role for the placement matches, so let's get into that. So at number 8, let's talk DPS placements. I'll get into the support and then the tank here in a moment. My biggest piece of advice here is that you really need to be outputting consistent damage and constant damage. This is the only thing that I might not necessarily advise you to do while playing a regular game of comp, and only do in placements. This is probably the biggest factor in getting a higher placement while still getting that nice huge SR multiplier, where I was gaining like 80 to 100 SR per win regardless of what SR was, even in that 4300 SR range. If I did a ton of damage to shields and enemies on DPS during my placements, even when I was probably feeding the enemy support ult, it directly correlated to a higher SR than the previous season when I look at the damage dealt on a few accounts after DPS placements. Otherwise, just play like normal and do what you gotta do to win. At number 7, support placements. Like with the DPS placements, bulk healing is a pretty big deal, but that's pretty straightforward with support anyway. Unlike where DPS constantly dealing damage need to worry about feeding the enemy support ult, supports can heal as much as they want, and it doesn't feed ult percent to somebody on the enemy team. Rather, with support, I'll recommend that in your placements you should definitely work on getting more assists with your non-healing abilities like booping enemies into your team, discording, power boosting, etc. all supports can assist in kills one way or another, so getting a bit of offensive and defensive kill participation goes a pretty long way while keeping that integrity in your gameplay. Don't overextend, just play a bit more aggressive in those moments where your team could use a bit more damage rather than healing.
Oh my god!
And finally, at number 6 on this list, the tank placements. This one was rough, I'm not gonna lie, since the difference between main tank stats and off tank stats is huge, so there's no real one stat to rule them all. Looking at my own stats across my all 8 accounts, I didn't notice anything that really stood out to me either that led to a huge boost in SR during my placements or something like that, so that just leads me to believe that you really need to pick up the slack from your teammates that failed to fulfill their role to help your teammates do better to get wins faster and avoid those super close games. The matchmaker works on a % chance to win system, so if the team that was determined to be more likely to win by the matchmaker ends up losing, then that team loses more SR and the team that won gains a lot more. So basically, if you were less likely to win, but you do end up winning decisively, you gain a lot more SR. So that makes me believe that having decisive wins or fast wins means a higher gain in SR. So if your supports are not healing that well, protect your DPS, and if your DPS aren't DPSing, either help them out by dealing damage or create space, or just help them to not feed their brains out. That's pretty much what a good matchmaking tank does anyway though, so this tip may not be all that helpful to you, so your mileage may vary. At number 5, moving along into the actual games of role queue after placements, let's talk role queue tips. I kind of alluded to it in the last tip. Something that you have to really do in role queue is pick up slack from bad players in a specific role. To really climb in role queue, you must absolutely master this, since the biggest difference between a win and a loss tends to be mistakes made by your teammates rather than plays by the enemy team. If you can prevent that from happening all of the time, you're sure to climb. So you want to be figuring out what you can do to help your teammates that you think that just aren't exactly doing their job. I don't mean becoming a DPS Moira just because your Widowmaker is the body shot queen. What I mean is providing the space for that Widowmaker so that she has more time to land shots and to do her job, because more often than not, the issue doesn't actually lie with the Widowmaker's ability to land shots and just how bad she is, but rather the Widowmaker just has some external force from the enemy team that's just causing her a ton of trouble, whether that's the Ryan shield or some Tracer flanking her, or even an enemy Widowmaker, which all 3 of those things you can deal with from any role in the game. Let's get into the specifics for each role. For DPS, if your supports are awful, just absolutely horrible, I recommend that you just swap to something that's easier to heal, or maybe go something that has self-heal, not like Soldier, but something like Reaper that heals via damage, or maybe Doomfist since he has so much survivability. Or you can go somebody like Sombra, who has a really stellar escape option. This is actually the most difficult role to compensate for. If your supports are bad, they're just bad and they don't heal, and it's pretty difficult to get around that fact. If your tanks are beating their brains out, you can play super aggressive with them. It may actually pay off more than you think. If your tanks just aren't pushing up and they're playing too passive, going on a flank can be more useful because you'll open up space since the enemy team has to turn around and deal with you instead of your tanks, and hopefully your tanks will push up. Or you can just outrange the enemy with the sniper. Since your tanks are playing so far back, you might as well use that shield or that protection. It turns out that bad tanks usually just are a consequence of them either playing too passive or too aggro, so you can usually play just with them and help them out. And if they're complaining about too much damage being dealt to them and they're saying, oh, my shield's always broken, swap to the counter of the enemy that's doing too much damage. So if it's a Junkrat, go Pharah, or maybe, Hitscan or something like that. Even if you're not the best in the world at that pick, sometimes just swapping to the counter alone is enough to help. For supports, it's pretty simple. Whoever is not doing that well, either heal them more or heal the other role more. Just focus on healing one role that's doing well or compensate for the role that is really bad. The way that you decide this is also really simple. If your tanks are feeding so hard that you just can't heal enough to help them out, tell your DPS that you're going to pocket them a bit more so that you can let your tanks and your DPS play aggressive and be up in there, and that usually helped in my experience. And if your tanks aren't feeding that incredibly hard and you can out heal the damage that they're taking, then you can focus on them and your DPS can play the space that your tanks are making. You really just want to make the decision based off of how your tanks are doing. Your tanks are going to help your DPS if your DPS are playing with your tanks, and if your DPS are playing poorly because they're constantly on flanks and feeding that way, I mean, it's pretty hard to help them out anyway, so it's just worth keeping your tanks alive and boosting them instead of the DPS that is permanently in the enemy backline. And finally, on the tank side, if your supports are really bad, you're probably gonna be in a rough spot. Supports are super difficult to compensate for in the role queue meta. You may just want to play passively and hope that your DPS can take some picks here and there from the safety of your protection, but it's just really hard to deal with that. If your DPS are bad on the other hand, you can just play aggressive and 90% of the time that issue gets fixed really fast. The gist of this whole compensating for your team generally ends up being playing with your team where they're playing. Bad DPS are almost always just too aggressive, and if you play aggro with them, it helps them out even if they just can't aim, since they'll have so much more time without anyone on them, which means more time to aim since you're going to be deep in the enemy lines. Don't feed, just play up a bit more, and it's not about getting picks, it's just about making that space for your bad DPS players. And finally, at number 1, my last tip for climbing in role queue is studying the meta and matchups. Since you're always going to have 2 of each role, you really want to practice playing heroes that complement each other more. Don't go hog if your team has a Ryan, and don't go Baptiste if you have a Winston and a Diva. Just play what your team already has. Play good comps and you'll have a better time and be a better player. That's just the best way to climb in my experience. On top of that, it also helps your team to do better and make less mistakes, which at the end of the day is really the deciding factor of comp games. But don't go blindly into it. Learn what makes a Ryan Zarya comp work so that way you can actually play a good Ryan Zarya comp. Learn why Mercy with double sniper is so strong, etc. The best way to do that is just by watching pro play, watching streamers, and watching your own gameplay and looking at your mistakes and where things could have gone better. It's not the most fun way to improve, but hey, you want to improve, so that's how, and it seriously does help a lot. Just a little goes a long way. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Let me know what you thought about this video, and if you have any other tips or tricks, comment down below and help each other out. As always, huge thanks to our guys over at Discord who use their Discord Nitro boost to give us cool server perks, and be sure to join since we have a really cool community over there. Also, we've got a Twitter and Instagram if that's your kind of thing, but anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Have a nice day. My name is Nate, and this was Blizzard Guides.